They say the lantern guides the lost. But here,
The last honest thing I did before the world narrowed down to four walls and a ceiling was return a library book. I remember that because of how stupid it sounds now, and because it was a Tuesday, and because the book was 3 weeks overdue, and I'd been carrying the guilt of it around like a pebble in my shoe. The Collected Poems of Jack Gilbert. I slid it through the return slot at the Enoch Pratt Free Library on Cathedral Street, heard it thump against whatever was already piled inside, and walked back toward my truck in the November rain, feeling like I'd settled a debt with the universe. I'm a building engineer. Not the kind with a degree and a title block. The kind who keeps old systems alive. Boilers, chillers, pneumatic controls from the Carter administration, fire pumps that groan like arthritic dogs when they cycle. I've worked the same downtown Baltimore high-rise for 11 years. 42 floors. The Harmon Building, built in 1971, converted partially to residential on floors 20 through 36, commercial below, mechanical above and below. I know every valve seat, every riser, every bypass that some contractor jury-rigged in 1994, and nobody ever documented. I know which elevator car drifts left when it passes the 22nd floor. I know the smell the cooling tower makes in August when the treatment's off and Legionella is breeding in the fill. I know that building the way most people know their own kitchen. That matters because 3 days after I returned that library book, I locked myself inside it. Not by choice. Not exactly. But not entirely by accident either. My name is Harold Bosch. Hal to anyone who isn't serving me a summons. I was 53 that November, divorced 9 years. One daughter, Naomi, living in Bend, Oregon, teaching 4th grade, pregnant with her first. My ex-wife, Claudette, remarried and living in Towson, which was close enough to be uncomfortable and far enough to be irrelevant. I had a one-bedroom in Highlandtown, a 2011 F-150 with rust colonizing the wheel wells, a savings account that would survive about 4 months of unemployment, and the kind of quiet loneliness that doesn't announce itself. It just sits in the passenger seat and never gets out. I was not a prepper. I was not a survivalist. I was not even particularly handy outside my specific domain. What I was specifically was a man who understood closed systems. How buildings breathe, how they drink, how they keep warm, how they die. And when the outbreak started, when the news shifted from cautious to frantic to incomprehensible over 72 hours, I did not head for the hills or the coast or some bunker. I went to work. That needs explaining. The pathogen. And I'm going to use that word because I never learned a better one. Because by the time they were naming it officially, the broadcast had stopped. Was respiratory. Airborne, they said. Then they said droplet. Then they said airborne again. Extremely lethal. Not like the flu, not like COVID, not like anything with a survival rate worth mentioning. The initial estimates on the news, before the news became a looping emergency graphic with no anchor behind the desk, ranged from 60 to 80% fatality. The incubation was fast, 2 days, maybe 3. Symptom onset to crisis in under 40 hours. They were comparing it to a weaponized influenza variant, though nobody used the word weaponized on camera. They just kept saying novel and unprecedented and shelter in place immediately, with the kind of vocal control that told you the person reading the teleprompter wanted to be anywhere else. Baltimore locked down on a Friday. The governor's order came at 11 in the morning. By 2 in the afternoon, I could hear the sirens from my apartment stacking up like a cord that wouldn't resolve. By evening, the grocery stores were either stripped or shuttered, and the pharmacy on Eastern Avenue had its window smashed in. I sat on my couch with a can of pinto beans and watched a man on television. Some deputy secretary of something explained that the national stockpile of antivirals was being deployed to priority regions, and that citizens should avoid all unnecessary contact, and that this was a temporary measure, and that the government was in control of the situation. He was sweating through his shirt. I called Naomi. She picked up on the first ring, which told me she was already scared. We talked for 12 minutes. She told me Ben was locking down too. She told me her husband, Aaron, was stocking their garage. She told me she was 7 months along and her OB had canceled all in-person appointments. She told me to stay inside. Then she said, "Dad, where are you going to go?" and I told her the truth because I was too tired to lie. The building. She didn't argue as much as I expected. Naomi understood, in the way children of maintenance workers understand, that I thought about shelter differently than most people. My apartment in Highlandtown was a second-floor walk-up with electric baseboard heat, no generator, no backup water, windows that leaked air like cheesecloth, and one exit onto a street already sounding wrong. The Harmon building had a diesel generator on the sub-basement level, 1,800 gallons in the belly tank. It had a fire pump that could pressurize a domestic water system long after city pressure failed, assuming the mains held. It had a roof, mechanical rooms with lockable doors, a loading dock I could barricade. It had food in the commercial kitchens on floors 2 through 4, the law firm's catering pantry, the insurance company's break room, the vending machines on every 5th floor. It had medical kits in every stairwell. It had tools. It had, more than anything, separation. Height, concrete and steel between me and whatever was happening on the streets. I drove in Saturday morning. The roads were strange. Not empty, but moving wrong. Full of vehicles loaded past their springs with belongings and people heading in contradictory directions, like a hive that had lost its queen. I parked in the loading dock, pulled the roll-down gate behind me, and padlocked it from the inside. I had a duffel with clothes, my medications, lisinopril for blood pressure, omeprazole for the reflux that had been chewing at me since the divorce, a case of bottled water, a flashlight, a battery radio, and a sleeping bag. That was it. The building was almost empty. Friday's lockdown order had sent most tenants home in a scramble. The residential floors had cleared out fast. People grabbing what they could and heading to family, to suburbs, to anywhere that wasn't a shared ventilation high-rise in a city. Smart, honestly. I would have advised the same, but a few stayed. I found Mrs. Okafor on 26, Aday's Okafor, 71, retired pediatric nurse, 5'0", with hands that looked like they'd held 10,000 sick children and never once trembled. She was sitting in her living room with the television on mute and a cup of tea she hadn't touched. She looked at me through her open door the way you look at the mailman on Christmas. Surprised he'd bother. "Harold, you're not leaving?" "No, ma'am. Building needs someone." She considered this. "The building. Or you need the building." I didn't answer that. She didn't need me to. On 31, I found Marcus Webb, 28, software developer, worked remotely even before remote became mandatory. Thin, skittish, the kind of pale you get from monitors and takeout. He'd moved into the Harmons 6 months ago, and I'd spoken to him exactly twice, both times about his thermostat. He opened his door 3 inches and peered at me through the gap with an expression I can only describe as the face of a man who had already decided the world was ending and was annoyed that someone was interrupting his process of accepting it. "I'm staying," he said before I'd asked. "I have 6 weeks of food, canned, freeze-dried. I've been. I had a system. Before this, I was already—" He stopped, swallowed. "I'm fine." "Okay." I gave him my cell number. Building engineer. "I'm keeping the systems going as long as I can. If something breaks in your unit, water, heat, electric, call me, not 911. He almost smiled. "I don't think 911 is going to be a concern much longer." That was Saturday. By Monday, he was right. The rest of the residential floors were empty as far as I could confirm. I walked every hallway, knocked every door, listened. Nothing. The commercial floors, 1 through 19, were locked and dark. I had master keys. I checked the law firm's floor, the insurance company, the co-working space on 7, the medical clinic on 3. All abandoned. The clinic had been cleaned out in a hurry, cabinet doors standing open, a toppled IV stand, exam table paper torn and trailing on the floor. But the law firm's kitchen still had coffee, sugar, creamer, a case of sparkling water, a box of granola bars, and, God bless whoever organized their office parties, a full catering-size container of mixed nuts, and a case of canned soup that someone had clearly ordered for a winter food drive and never delivered. I made an inventory that first evening. I sat in the engineer's office on sub-level 1, surrounded by the hum of equipment I'd been tending for over a decade, and I wrote everything down on a legal pad. Diesel, approximately 1,800 gallons. Generator burn rate at quarter load, roughly 4 gallons per hour. That gave me about 450 hours. Call it 18 days of continuous run, but I wouldn't run it continuous. I'd cycle 2 hours on, 6 off, enough to keep the pipe systems from freezing, recharge anything that needed charging, run water when needed. That extended my window considerably. Maybe 60 days, maybe longer, depending on what I was willing to let go cold. Water, city mains were still pressurized Saturday. The building's domestic water tanks, two 10,000-gallon tanks on the mechanical floor above 36, were full. That was 20,000 gallons. For 3 people, at a gallon a day for drinking and half a gallon for sanitation, that was over 4,000 days. Water was not the problem. Food, that was the problem. My inventory across all accessible kitchens, vending machines, and break rooms totaled maybe 3 weeks of calories for 3 people if I was conservative. Maybe 4 if I was cruel about portions. After that, we'd be eating condiment packets and coffee creamer. Heat, the building's heating was hydronic. Hot water through baseboard radiators, heated by a gas-fired boiler. The gas main was still live on Saturday. If the gas held, heat was covered. If the gas failed, I'd have to think about the diesel generator and portable electric heaters from the maintenance closet, which would burn through my fuel window fast. I wrote all of this down, column by column, supply by supply, day by day. Then I sat back in my chair and listened to the boiler fire, that deep ignition sound I'd heard 10,000 times, and I thought, this is a siege, and I am the castle's only mechanic. The first week was about rhythm. I established one because rhythm is how you keep a building alive, and I suspected it was how you kept a person alive too. I woke at 5:30, same as always. The sleeping bag was laid out on the couch in the engineer's office, which was warm. The boiler room shared a wall, and the residual heat kept the space at a steady 68 degrees, even without direct heating. I'd brush my teeth with bottled water over the utility sink, eat something small, a granola bar, a handful of nuts, and then make rounds. Rounds took 2 hours. I'd check the boiler first, flame pattern, stack temperature, condensate return, then the domestic water pumps, then the generator, even when it wasn't running, because diesel engines sitting idle in cold weather develop opinions about starting, and you need to keep them warm and exercised. Then the elevator machine room. I'd shut down 3 of the 4 elevators to conserve, keeping one operational for moving supplies between floors. Then the electrical switchgear. Then a walkthrough of the first 3 floors to check the building envelope, doors, windows, loading dock. After rounds, I'd bring food to Mrs. Okafor and check on Marcus. This became the human part of the day, and I'll be honest, I needed it more than either of them did. Mrs. Okafor received me each morning like a queen granting an audience. She'd put on a house dress and slippers, have her tea properly made by the time I knocked, and ask me about the building's condition with the clinical precision of someone who'd spent 40 years triaging the sick. She wanted numbers. How much diesel? What was the water level in the tanks? What was the outside temperature? She wrote these in a small notebook with a ballpoint pen, and when I asked her why, she said, "Because someone should be keeping records, Harold, in case someone reads them after." That hit me in a place I wasn't ready to examine. Marcus was harder. He'd open his door, take whatever food I offered, and retreat. For the first 4 days, our exchanges lasted under a minute. He was polite technically, but in the way that a closed fist is technically not a punch. On day 5, I brought him a can of minestrone soup from the law firm's kitchen, heated on a portable burner I'd found in the maintenance closet, and he looked at it like I'd handed him a small, warm animal. "You heated it?" Seemed like the thing to do. He held the can with both hands and stood there in his doorway, and I could see past him into his apartment, blackout curtains drawn, monitors dark, a meticulous stack of canned goods arranged on his kitchen counter like a barricade. He was wearing the same gray hoodie he'd worn every day since I'd met him. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Not suspicious, genuinely confused. I told him what was true. I don't know how to sit still. Outside, Baltimore was becoming something else. The first 3 days I could hear traffic, sirens, the occasional helicopter. By day 4, the traffic sounds thinned to nothing. The sirens continued but grew sporadic, not the urgent wail of a system responding, but the exhausted moan of a system failing. On day 5, I went to the roof. I shouldn't have. It wasn't information I needed. But the animal part of my brain needed to see the way you can't stop yourself from looking at a wound. The skyline looked normal from 42 stories up. That was the cruelty of it. The building stood, the harbor was there, the stadiums, the steeple of the basilica, the cranes at the port. Nothing was burning. Nothing was collapsed. The apocalypse, it turns out, doesn't always come with a visual. Sometimes it just empties the streets and leaves the architecture standing like a theater set after the actors have left. But the roads were wrong. Cars stopped at odd angles, some with doors open. A city bus sat diagonal across Pratt Street, its route sign still cycling, and the sound, or the lack of it. 42 floors up on a normal day, you'd hear the city as a continuous hum, a frequency so constant it becomes silence. Now the hum was gone, and what replaced it was actual silence. The kind that has texture, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware that your own heartbeat is a sound. I went back downstairs and didn't go to the roof again for 12 days. The radio told me pieces. WBAL held out longest. Their signal was strong, their transmitter on Television Hill had backup power, and someone there was committed to broadcasting. I'd listen during my evening meal, sitting in the engineer's office with a can of whatever I'd selected for the day, and the voice on the radio. A woman named, or at least calling herself, Diane, would read reports that sounded increasingly like dispatches from a war that was already lost. Hospitals overwhelmed. National Guard deployed but experiencing significant attrition. Quarantine zones established and then abandoned. A death toll that stopped being a number and became a word. Catastrophic. She'd sign off each broadcast with, "Stay inside. Help is being organized. We'll be back tomorrow." And each tomorrow, her voice was a little flatter, a little more carefully controlled. The voice of someone reading her own obituary in advance and trying to keep her composure. On day 9, she didn't come back. The frequency went to static. I turned the dial slowly through the entire AM and FM bands, searching, and found one station, a low-power AM signal, barely intelligible through the interference, playing what sounded like a pre-recorded loop of someone reading Bible verses. Revelation, mostly. I listened for 10 minutes, decided it wasn't helping, and turned the radio off. I told Mrs. Okafor and Marcus separately. Mrs. Okafor nodded and wrote it in her notebook. Day 9. Radio silence. Marcus closed his door without responding. Day 14 is when the building tried to kill us. I should clarify, the building didn't try anything. Buildings don't have intentions, but they have physics, and physics doesn't care about your situation. The temperature outside had dropped to 19 degrees. Mid-November in Baltimore isn't usually that brutal, but a cold front had pushed down from Canada and parked itself over the mid-Atlantic like it had nowhere else to be. The boiler was running fine. The gas main was still live, which I checked each morning by lighting a burner on the law firm's kitchen stove and watching the flame. Blue and steady, still fed, still burning. What failed was the condensate return pump on the heating loop for floors 20 through 30. The pump was original, 1971, cast iron, a Bell & Gossett Series 60 that had been rebuilt twice during my tenure and needed rebuilding, a third time that I'd been requesting for 2 years. The bearing seized. I heard it from 2 floors away. A grinding screech that resonated through the pipe risers like a scream in a cathedral. By the time I got to the mechanical room on the 20th floor, the pump was locked. The motor was pulling locked rotor amps. The overload had tripped, and the heating loop for 16 floors of residential space was dead. Mrs. Okafor was on 26. Marcus was on 31. The building didn't cool instantly. Thermal mass is real. Concrete and steel hold heat the way a cast iron pan holds heat after you take it off the burner. But in 19-degree weather, with wind pushing against a curtain wall that was never designed for insulation, the temperature in those units would drop below 50 within 8 hours and keep falling. Pipes and exterior walls would be at risk of freezing within 24 hours. A frozen pipe in a 42-story building is not a plumbing problem. It's a structural event. When a 2-inch copper riser freezes and bursts on the 23rd floor, the water damage cascades downward through every floor below it, destroying ceilings, electrical panels, and anything in its path. I had maybe 6 hours to fix this before it became unfixable. The bearing was gone. I didn't have a replacement, not for a 60-year-old pump that size, but I had worked in this building for 11 years, and I knew things about it that weren't in any manual. I knew that in the mechanical room on the 38th floor, serving the upper residential loop, there was an identical pump. Same model, same vintage, same Bell & Gossett pedigree, that I'd rebuilt 18 months ago with a fresh bearing kit. That pump was healthy, and that upper loop served floors 32 through 36, which were empty. The math was ugly but simple. I could pull the good pump from 38, carry it down to 20, and install it on the failed loop. That would restore heat to 20 through 30, including Mrs. Okafor's floor. It would leave the upper loop dead, but since nobody was living above 31, the only risk was frozen pipes in empty units. I could drain those risers to prevent freezing, which would take time but was doable. Or I could drain the lower loop too, move everyone to the commercial floors below 20 or a separate heating system. A rooftop unit with its own gas connection. Still functioned. That would mean abandoning the residential floors entirely, moving Mrs. Okafor down 20-some floors with whatever she could carry, and surrendering the part of the building that felt most like shelter. I chose the pump swap, partly because it was the right engineering call, partly because I couldn't face telling Mrs. Okafor she had to leave her home. A Bell & Gossett Series 60 in that configuration weighs about 85 pounds. 85 pounds of cast iron with flanged connections that need to be unbolted from the piping, disconnected from electrical, transported 18 floors, and reinstalled with new gaskets on connections that were last disturbed during the first Bush administration. I'm 53 with a bad left knee and blood pressure that my doctor described, the last time I saw him, as enthusiastic. I started at 9 in the morning. I shut down the upper loop, closed the isolation valves, drained the pump volute, and began unbolting. The flange bolts were corroded. Every one of them fought me. I worked with a pipe wrench and a breaker bar in language that would have made my mother leave the room. By 11, the pump was free. I disconnected the electrical, 208 volts, 3-phase, and I was careful, because getting electrocuted alone in a mechanical room during the end of the world seemed like a particularly meaningless way to die. I carried the pump to the service elevator. 85 pounds isn't impossible, but it's 85 pounds of awkward iron with no good handholds, and I had to bear hug it against my chest and waddle. My lower back began a conversation with me that I knew would continue for days. The elevator brought me from 38 to 20. I carried the pump from the elevator to the mechanical room, set it on the floor, and sat down next to it on the concrete, breathing in a way that was embarrassing even with no one watching. The installation took 3 more hours. The flange bolt patterns matched. Thank God for standardization. But the gaskets on the existing connections were brittle and cracked when I disturbed them. I'd brought gasket material from the shop, the thick red rubber sheet we kept for exactly these situations, and I cut new ones with a utility knife, working on the floor with my reading glasses sliding down my sweating nose. I aligned the pump, torqued the bolts in a star pattern the way the manual said, and the way my hands remembered, reconnected the wiring, double-checked the rotation, because a pump spinning backwards looks like it's working, but moves nothing, and opened the isolation valves. The pump started on the first try. The motor hummed, water moved. I held my hand against the supply riser and felt it warm, degree by degree, as heated water began its climb toward 26 floors of empty apartments and one small woman with a notebook. I sat on the mechanical room floor for 15 minutes after that, my back against the wall, my hands shaking not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash of sustained physical effort by someone who was no longer built for sustained physical effort. My knees ached. My palms were raw from the wrench. The taste in my mouth was copper and exertion. Then I went upstairs to drain the empty risers on the upper floors before they froze, because the day wasn't done with me yet. It was Mrs. Okafor who broke me open. Not all at once. She was too precise for that. She did it the way a nurse removes a bandage, steadily, without apology, knowing the air needs to reach the wound. Day 17, the heating loop was stable. I'd settled into a rhythm of checking the transplanted pump every 4 hours, which was obsessive and unnecessary but gave me structure. Marcus had begun leaving his door open when I made my rounds. Not wide, just ajar, a crack that I understood as the maximum vulnerability he could currently tolerate. Mrs. Okafor had begun cooking. She'd found in a neighbor's abandoned unit on her floor. She had her own ideas about locked doors, and I learned not to ask. A bag of rice, a jar of palm oil, dried crayfish, and a tin of ground agouti. She cooked in her own kitchen with the building's gas-fed stove, and the smell that drifted into the hallway was so aggressively alive, so insistently normal, that it stopped me mid-step on my way to check a riser valve. She invited me to eat. I sat at her small dining table, and she placed a plate in front of me with the kind of authority that does not accept refusal. The agouti soup was thick, peppery, and tasted like someone's entire history. I ate in silence until the plate was half empty, and then she spoke. "You haven't called your daughter. Phones are down. Cell towers have battery backup, some of them. You told me this yourself on day 3. You said the towers would hold for a week, maybe 2, before the backup power failed. That was 14 days ago. You didn't call her during that window." I put my fork down. The call wouldn't go through. The networks were overloaded. "Did you try?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the building. "Harold, I tried twice. The first day. The network couldn't handle it. Everyone was calling everyone. And then I got busy with the building, with the supplies, with the rounds, and I thought I'd try again in the morning. And the morning came and I had to check the generator. And then the water pressure was dropping, and I had to bleed the air out of the—" "Harold." Her voice was the same one she must have used on panicked parents for 40 years. Firm, warm, bottomless. "You didn't call because you were afraid she wouldn't answer." I stared at the agouti soup. The oil had separated slightly at the edges, small orange crescents on the white plate. "If she answered," Mrs. Okafor continued, "you would know she was alive, and you would have to accept that you were here, and she was there, and there was nothing connecting you except the knowledge of each other's survival. And if she didn't answer—" "Please stop." She stopped. She picked up her tea and drank. Outside the window, the light was the flat gray of a Baltimore November that has given up on the idea of afternoon. "I have 3 sons," she said after a while. "Emeka is in Lagos. Chidi is in London. Obina was in Silver Spring." She used the past tense for the last one without emphasis, the way you state a measurement. "I don't know which of them are alive. I assume Emeka is because Nigeria has experience with epidemics and he is stubborn. I hope Chidi is because London has resources. Obina," she paused, "Obina had asthma and a wife who was pregnant, and I have been sitting in this apartment for 17 days knowing that Silver Spring is 35 miles from here, and I cannot walk 35 miles, and there are no working cars, and the roads are not safe, and I am 71 years old." She looked at me directly. "So I write in my notebook. I cook when there is food. I say my prayers, and I do not pretend that I am not terrified, because pretending is exhausting, and I am too old for exhausting things. You should try it, the not pretending. It is lighter than you think." I nodded. I couldn't speak. She didn't need me to. We finished eating in silence, and then I washed the plates in the kitchen sink with cold water and a drop of dish soap and the domesticity of it. The clink of ceramic, the slick of soap between my fingers, the sound of water in a drain was so unreasonably tender that I had to stop and press my palms flat against the counter and breathe. Marcus appeared on day 19, not at his door. In the hallway outside Mrs. Okafor's unit, standing there like a heron that had accidentally wandered into a building and wasn't sure what to do with its legs. He was holding a laptop. "The internet is down," he said, which was not news. "Yes. But I downloaded some things. Before, movies, music. I have a portable speaker. I thought maybe, he gestured vaguely toward Mrs. Okafor's door. I don't know, the quiet is getting to me. That evening, the three of us sat in Mrs. Okafor's living room and listened to Marcus's downloaded music on a small Bluetooth speaker. He'd curated apparently a library of several hundred albums across genres I would never have predicted. Fela Kuti, Bill Evans, Hank Williams, a Japanese ambient artist whose name I couldn't retain. Mrs. Okafor chose the Fela Kuti and closed her eyes and swayed in her armchair, and Marcus sat on the floor with his knees drawn up and looked for the first time since I'd met him like someone who had not given up. I sat in a dining chair and listened to Water No Get Enemy fill the apartment, and I thought about Naomi. I thought about her in a house in Bend, Oregon, 7 months pregnant, surrounded by mountains I'd never seen, married to a man I'd met exactly 4 times, living a life I knew only through phone calls and occasional photographs. I thought about what Mrs. Okafor had said, that I hadn't called because I was afraid. And I knew she was right, and I knew there was nothing I could do about it now. And the music kept playing, and I stayed in the chair because leaving would have required a strength I didn't have. By the end of the 3rd week, we developed a household. That's the only word for it, though it was a household spread across 10 floors of a concrete tower in a dead city. Mrs. Okafor cooked when we had ingredients that warranted cooking, and rationed when we didn't. Marcus, once he emerged from his shell, turned out to have a meticulous mind for inventory. He built a spreadsheet on his laptop, no internet required, he reminded me, with something like pride, that tracked every calorie, every gallon, every hour of diesel. I kept the building alive. The food situation was getting honest. Marcus's spreadsheet, he'd color-coded it, red for critical, yellow for watch, green for adequate, showed 21 days of food remaining at our current intake, which he'd calculated at roughly 1,400 calories per person per day. That was below what any of us needed, especially me, burning energy on physical maintenance work. But it was enough to function, enough to think clearly, not enough to feel full, not enough to stop thinking about food during the long hours between meals. I began searching the commercial floors more systematically, not just kitchens and break rooms. Offices, desks, drawers. People keep food at work. Protein bars in desk drawers, trail mix in filing cabinets, emergency candy and purses left behind in the rush. I cataloged every floor, every suite, every desk, and the haul was better than I'd expected, but worse than I'd hoped. Another 10 days maybe, mixed quality, a lot of candy and chips. Calorie-dense but nutritionally bankrupt. Some protein bars. A single can of almonds that I treated like gold. Marcus accompanied me on these searches, and it was during one of them. Floor 12, an accounting firm with motivational posters on every wall, that he told me about himself. Not all at once. In fragments, the way people do when they're not sure if honesty will be met with judgment. He'd been agoraphobic, not casually anxious. Clinically, deeply can't leave the apartment agoraphobic. He'd been in treatment. The remote job wasn't a lifestyle preference, it was a medical accommodation. His food stockpile wasn't prepper paranoia, it was the emergency supply of a man who sometimes couldn't leave his apartment for days and needed to know he wouldn't starve during a bad episode. The thing is, he said, sitting on the floor of the accounting firm's break room while I checked behind the refrigerator for anything that might have rolled there. The thing that's funny, not funny, but I spent 3 years being afraid of the outside world, and now the outside world actually is dangerous, and I feel more functional than I have in months. Like the anxiety was correct all along, and now I don't have to argue with it. I found a jar of peanut butter behind the refrigerator. Unopened, shelf-stable, about 28 ounces. Roughly 4,500 calories. I held it up like a trophy, and Marcus actually laughed. And the sound was so unexpected in that dead building that it echoed. The generator was running on schedule. 2 hours on, 6 hours off, with adjustments for overnight heating when the temperature dropped. Diesel consumption was tracking close to Marcus's projections. We'd used about 400 gallons in 3 weeks, leaving roughly 1,400. At the current burn rate, that was another 10 or 11 weeks. Longer than the food would last, but fuel and food aren't interchangeable problems. What worried me more was the gas. I checked the kitchen stove every morning, and every morning the flame was blue and steady. But gas pressure, like water pressure, depends on infrastructure that depends on people. Compressor stations, regulators, maintenance. If the gas failed, we'd lose boiler heat instantly, and the building would begin to cool in a way that the diesel generator couldn't compensate for. Not across 42 floors, not even across the 10 we were using. I'd have to consolidate everyone to 1 or 2 floors and heat them electrically, which would burn diesel 4 times as fast. I didn't share this worry with Mrs. Okafor or Marcus because I hadn't figured out what to do about it yet, and sharing a problem without a solution felt like distributing weight I should be carrying alone. The other thing I didn't share was what I'd seen on the roof. I'd gone back up on day 20. I told myself it was to check the rooftop exhaust fans and the cooling tower basin. The basin needed to be drained before it froze and cracked. And those were real tasks. But I also looked. The city was different now, not destroyed. Still standing, still recognizable. But there were signs, a column of smoke far to the east near the harbor that burned for 3 days before exhausting itself. Cars that had clearly been moved, pushed to the sides of certain roads, creating corridors. By whom I didn't know, but the organized pattern suggested someone, somewhere, was still working. And on the street directly below, on Cathedral, I could see what I thought at first were bundles of clothing left on the sidewalk. They were not bundles of clothing. I counted 9 and then I stopped counting and went back inside and drained the cooling tower basin and didn't mention it to anyone. The nights were the hardest. Not because of cold. The heating loop was holding, and sub-level 1 stayed warm regardless. Not because of noise. The city made almost no sound after dark. Because of the quiet and the time and the absence of distraction, which combined to create a space in which I could not avoid thinking. I thought about Naomi. I thought about whether she was alive, and the thought had a physical weight, like a hand pressing on my sternum. I thought about Claudette, which surprised me. I hadn't thought about her in months. But the mind under siege doesn't respect your emotional filing system. I thought about my father, who'd been a maintenance man too, at a school in Dundalk, and who died at 61 of a heart attack while changing an air filter in a gymnasium. I thought about whether dying alone in a building you'd kept alive was hereditary. I thought about whether I should leave. The gas died on day 31. I knew before the boiler did. I'd developed a habit, obsessive probably but useful, of lighting the kitchen stove on 12 every morning at 6, and on day 31, the burner clicked and produced nothing. No hiss, no flame, just the mechanical snap of an igniter with nothing to ignite. I ran. Down the stairs, which I'd been using more than the elevator to conserve diesel, 16 flights from 12 to sub-basement. My knees screaming, my breathing loud in the stairwell. The boiler had already sensed the loss. The flame's safeguard controller had tripped on low gas pressure, exactly as designed, locking out the burner. The boiler sat there, massive and inert, its jacket still warm to the touch but cooling. The circulator pumps continued running, pushing water through the loop, but the water was no longer being heated. Within hours, the loop temperature would drop below useful. Within a day, it would be ambient. Outside air temperature that morning, 24 degrees. I stood in front of the dead boiler and felt the walls of my plan contract around me. The math was immediate and merciless. Without gas, heat required electric resistance. Space heaters, baseboard units, anything that converted electrical energy to thermal energy. The building's electric service was still live from the grid, which had held longer than I'd expected, probably because demand had dropped to near zero. But the grid was unreliable. It flickered, browned out, went dark for hours at a stretch. When it failed, the diesel generator was all we had. Running space heaters on a diesel generator was like heating a house by burning money. It worked, but the cost was ruinous. I did the calculation on Marcus's spreadsheet while he watched over my shoulder. If I consolidated all 3 of us to a single floor, say 12, which was central, interior, with fewer exterior walls, and ran 4 portable electric heaters to maintain 55 degrees in 3 occupied rooms, the electrical load would be about 24 kilowatts. The generator could handle that, But at that load, diesel consumption jumped to roughly 8 gallons an hour during runtime. If I maintained the 2 on, 6 off cycle, that was 16 gallons per cycle, 4 cycles per day, 64 gallons per day. 1,400 gallons remaining divided by 64 gave us 22 days. 22 days. Marcus stared at his spreadsheet. The cells had gone red. We can reduce the heating, he said. Keep one room warm, 45 degrees in the rest. 45 degrees won't freeze the pipes if we keep the one room's heat bleeding into the corridor. Maybe, depends on when, but 45 degrees is... I stopped. 45 degrees is survivable if you're dressed for it and under blankets. It's not comfortable. It's not pleasant. It's the kind of cold that wears you down over days, that drains you incrementally, that makes you stupid and slow exactly when you need to be sharp. Mrs. Okafor received the news with the preternatural calm I'd come to rely on. She folded her hands in her lap and said, "Then we move downstairs and we wear our coats." We moved on day 32. I chose a suite on 12. The accounting firm with the motivational posters, because it had interior offices with no exterior walls, a break room with running water, from the gravity-fed tanks, no pump needed, and carpet, which insulated better than the bare concrete on lower floors. Marcus and I carried blankets, food stores, the portable burner, and Mrs. Okafor's notebook and tea supplies. Mrs. Okafor walked the 14 floors down herself, slowly, one hand on the railing, refusing my arm with a look that could strip paint. The first night on 12 was grim, the space heater. A single 1,500-watt unit, all I was willing to run. Kept the interior office at about 52 degrees. We slept in sleeping bags on the floor, fully clothed. Marcus slept, or appeared to. Mrs. Okafor prayed quietly and then was silent. I lay awake and listened to the building tick and settle around me. The sounds a structure makes when its temperature changes. The thermal expansion and contraction of steel and concrete. And I thought, 22 days? And then what? I had been avoiding this question with the discipline of a man ignoring a lump he's afraid to have examined. And then what? If rescue came? If the government or the military or some reconstituted authority appeared? Then the diesel was just a bridge. But nothing I'd heard in 3 weeks of radio silence suggested rescue was coming. The loop of Bible verses had stopped on day 23. The AM band was empty. The grid flickered on and off with no pattern, no communication, no sign that anyone was managing it. Baltimore was running on inertia systems designed with enough redundancy to outlast their operators by weeks, slowly winding down as fuel exhausted, batteries drained, water pressure dropped. I could leave. I could walk out the loading dock door and try to reach. What? Another building? A shelter? The suburbs? I had no vehicle that would start after a month of sitting. The streets were impassable in places and dangerous everywhere. I had a 71-year-old woman and a 28-year-old man with agoraphobia, neither of whom could make a long foot journey in winter. And I had no destination, no intelligence, no map of what was safe and what wasn't. Or I could stay. Burn the diesel, keep one room warm. Ration the remaining food which Marcus now projected at 16 days. Wait for something to change. Day 34, the grid went down and didn't come back. The generator kicked on automatically. I'd wired the transfer switch to trigger on power loss. And the fluorescent lights in our occupied suite buzzed to life after a 3-second darkness that felt much longer. From that moment, every watt we used came from the diesel tank, and the 22-day countdown became the only clock that mattered. I developed a cough on day 35, not the pathogen. I'd been breathing recycled air in a sealed building for over a month, and whatever was killing people outside hadn't penetrated our envelope. It was a dry, persistent cough from the cold air and the dust and the stress, and it woke me at night and left a taste like rust in my throat. Mrs. Okafor listened to my chest with her ear pressed against my back. No stethoscope, but she didn't need one, and said, "You're not sick, you're exhausted, you're cold, and you're not eating enough." She was right about all three, but the food was what it was, and the cold was what it was, and the exhaustion wasn't going anywhere. Day 37, I sat in the break room at midnight drinking water from a paper cup, doing the arithmetic again as if the numbers might have changed. They hadn't. 14 days of diesel, 12 days of food, 286 total remaining hours of generator runtime at current load, and outside a city that was either dead or restructuring itself in ways I couldn't see from inside a building, and a silence so complete that some nights I pressed my ear to the window glass just to confirm there was still an outside. I thought about the pump swap. 85 pounds of cast iron carried 18 floors. I'd done that. It had taken everything I had, but I'd done it. 22 days had become 14, and I had not done anything. The dilemma arrived on day 39 in the form of a sound I hadn't heard in weeks. Someone knocking on the loading dock door. I was on sub-level 1, checking the diesel gauge. 940 gallons, falling when the knock came. 3 hits, then a pause, then 3 more. Not frantic, deliberate. Someone who knew that buildings have occupants and was asking, not demanding. I stood at the roll-down gate with a pipe wrench in my hand, which was absurd as a weapon, but was what I had, and I said, "Who's there?" "My name is Joy. I have a child with me. He's 6. We need to come inside." A woman's voice, hoarse, strained but controlled. I could hear the child, not crying, not speaking, just breathing in the way children breathe when they've been told to be quiet and are trying very hard. I did not open the gate, not yet. What I did was stand there with my hand on the padlock and run the arithmetic one more time. 940 gallons, 2 more people, 2 more mouths against a food supply already measured in days. A child who would need warmth, who would need calories, who would change the emotional calculus of every decision I'd make from this point forward. Every gallon of diesel I burned to heat one more body was a gallon I didn't burn for the 3 people already depending on me. Every can of soup I opened for a stranger was a can that didn't feed a DZ Okafor, who was 71 and had already lost weight I could see in her wrists. And a child, 6 years old. Outside in November, in a city where the bodies I'd counted from the roof had been 9, and that was weeks ago. I unlocked the padlock. The woman who came through the gate was about 35, wearing a coat that was too thin and shoes that were wrong. Ballet flats, the kind you wear to an office, caked with grime and torn at the sole. She was carrying a boy on her hip, and the boy was wrapped in a blanket that I recognized as a moving blanket, the kind you get from U-Haul, quilted and gray. Her face was gaunt, not starving, not yet, but emptied. Her eyes tracked the space behind me with an alertness that was more animal than human. "I'm Hal," I said, "building engineer. There are 2 others upstairs. We have heat and water. Limited food." She nodded. The boy turned his face toward me, and I saw that his eyes were enormous and dark and completely dry. He was past crying. Whatever had happened to bring them here had used up his tears days ago. Her name was Joy Kessler. The boy was Micah, her nephew. She didn't tell me where Micah's parents were, and I didn't ask because the answer was in the way she held him. Not like an aunt holding a nephew, but like a person holding the only thing left. She'd been sheltering in a row house in Fells Point with a group of 8. The group had fragmented. Disagreements about food, about leadership, about whether to stay or try to reach Fort Meade, where someone had heard there was a military safe zone. Joy had left with Micah after the food ran out, and the arguments turned physical. She'd walked from Fells Point to Cathedral Street, about 2 miles in daylight, through streets she described as empty mostly, but not all the way empty. She'd seen the Harmon building and noticed the lights in the upper floors, the faint glow from our occupied suite. And she'd knocked because light meant electricity, and electricity meant someone had kept something running. I brought her upstairs. I gave her water and a granola bar and one of the emergency Mylar blankets from the stairwell medical kit for Micah. I introduced her to Mrs. Okafor, who took one look at the boy and disappeared into our supplies and returned with a cup of rice porridge she must have been saving. And I watched Micah eat it with a focus so intense that it bordered on violence. And something in my chest compressed to a density I had not previously known was possible. Marcus looked at me after Joy and Micah had been settled in an adjacent office with blankets and a space heater that I turned on knowing exactly what it cost. "The food," he said quietly. I know. 12 days was for 3. With 5, it's 7. Maybe 8. I know, Marcus. He adjusted his glasses. I'm not saying we shouldn't have let them in. But we need another option. We can't just wait anymore. He was right, and I'd known he was right before Joy knocked on the door. I'd known it for days, sitting with the arithmetic, watching the numbers redshift on his spreadsheet. Waiting was not a strategy. It was a slow way of choosing to die in a warm room instead of a cold street, and the room was getting colder. The option I'd been avoiding was the obvious one. Someone had to leave the building. I made the decision on day 40. I didn't announce it. I didn't convene a meeting. I sat in the break room before anyone else was awake. 5 in the morning, the space heater humming, my breath visible in the parts of the room the heat didn't reach. And I made the decision the way you make all real decisions. Alone, already knowing and tired of pretending I hadn't. I would go out, on foot, south toward the inner harbor, then east along the waterfront. My destination was a Maryland Emergency Management Agency staging area that Diane on WBAL had mentioned once during her last week of broadcasting. A pre-positioned supply cache at the Baltimore Convention Center, stocked with MREs, medical supplies, water purification, and portable generators. She'd mentioned it as a distribution point for first responders, which meant it was provisioned for hundreds of people, maybe thousands. Even partially looted, even partially depleted, it would have more than enough to sustain 5 people for months. The convention center was 1.3 miles from the Harmon building, a 20-minute walk on a normal day. I told them over breakfast. A shared can of chicken noodle soup, heated on the burner, divided 5 ways. Even the broth was rationed. Micah got the most by silent consensus. Mrs. Okafor said nothing for a long time. Then, "You're the only one who can keep the generator running." "I've written down the procedure. Start, stop, fuel check. Marcus can handle it." Marcus looked ill. That thing is the size of a car." "You push a button and read a gauge. I'll walk you through it twice before I go." Joy held Micah on her lap and watched me with an expression I couldn't parse. She'd been with us for 2 days, and in that time she'd revealed herself to be competent, quiet, and fiercely observant. The kind of person who maps a room's dynamics before speaking. She'd also revealed that she'd been an EMT in a previous life, before she'd switched to medical billing, which meant she was the most medically trained person in the building, besides Mrs. Okafor, and younger by 4 decades. "I'll go with you," she said. "No. I'm faster than you. I'm younger. I know field triage if something goes wrong. Micah needs you here. Micah needs food. Micah needs someone to come back with food. And if neither of us comes back?" That stopped her. Micah pressed his face into her shoulder. He hadn't spoken a complete sentence since arriving. He communicated in nods, head shakes, and a tugging of Joy's sleeve when he needed something. He was not, as far as I could tell, in shock. His responses were appropriate. His eyes tracked. He ate and drank when offered. He was, in the way that some children are during crisis, simply waiting. Conserving. Holding himself in reserve for a future he'd decided to believe in, even if the adults around him weren't sure. "I go alone," I said. "If I'm not back by dark, assume I'm not coming back. Marcus knows the generator. Mrs. Okafor knows rationing. Joy knows medical. You have 7 days of food, maybe 8 if you stretch. That's your window to make a different plan." Mrs. Okafor opened her notebook and wrote the date. Then she wrote, "Herald, Convention Center, return by nightfall." She looked up. "I am writing this down so that if someone reads this notebook after we are gone, they will know you went. They will know you tried." I spent the rest of the morning preparing. I dressed in layers. Thermal undershirt, flannel, a Carhartt jacket from the maintenance closet that had belonged to my predecessor and still smelled faintly of his cigarettes. Work boots, thick socks, a knit cap. I fashioned a pack from a canvas tool bag, emptying it of wrenches and filling it with 2 bottles of water, the first aid kit from the stairwell on 12, a flashlight, and a crowbar. The crowbar was not for self-defense, I told myself. It was for prying open doors at the convention center. This was a lie I needed. Marcus walked through the generator procedure with me twice. He was shaking, but his hands were steady on the controls. I noticed this, the disconnect between his trembling body and his precise fingers, and I thought that whatever medication or therapy had been managing his agoraphobia before the world ended, the man underneath was more capable than he believed. At noon, I descended to the loading dock. The roll-down gate was padlocked from the inside. I had the key. I stood at the gate for what felt like a geological age, but was probably 40 seconds, listening. Nothing. No sound from outside except wind. I opened the padlock, lifted the gate 3 feet, ducked under, and pulled it back down behind me. The alley behind the Harmon building smelled like cold concrete and something organic I chose not to identify. The daylight was gray, overcast, a ceiling of clouds so uniform it looked painted. The temperature was around 28 degrees, and the wind came from the northwest and found every gap in my layers immediately. I had not been outside in 40 days. The scale of it, the sky, the distance, the open air, hit me like a physical force. I stood in the alley with my canvas bag over my shoulder and my crowbar in my right hand, and felt the agoraphobia that Marcus had described suddenly make perfect, visceral sense. The world was too big. It had too many directions, too many angles of approach. Inside the building, every threat had dimensions I could measure. Out here, a threat was omnidirectional and infinite. I walked. Cathedral Street was empty in the way that streets are empty in photographs of Chernobyl. The infrastructure intact, the life subtracted. Cars sat where they'd stopped. A FedEx truck had jumped the curb and come to rest against a parking meter, its rear doors open, packages spilling onto the sidewalk like a wound. Leaves had accumulated against every vertical surface, weeks of unswept autumn. A traffic light at the intersection of Cathedral and Saratoga blinked yellow, still powered by something, a tiny mechanical heartbeat that I found unreasonably moving. I passed the library, the Enoch Pratt Free Library, where I'd returned Jack Gilbert's poems 40 days ago. The front doors were closed, the windows were dark. A piece of paper was taped to the inside of the glass, handwritten in marker. Closed until further notice. Stay safe. Someone had added in different handwriting, water available inside. Help yourself. And someone else, in a third hand, God bless. I kept walking. Southlawn Cathedral, past the Basilica of the Assumption, its bronze doors shut, past Mulberry, past Saratoga, past Lexington. The buildings towered on either side, and the canyon between them channeled the wind into a blade that found my neck and settled there. I saw no one. I heard nothing. The city was a held breath. At Lombard Street, I turned east. The convention center was 4 blocks ahead, its blank, enormous facade visible from here. A building designed to hold tens of thousands of people, and now holding whatever had been left inside when the world stopped. I reached it at 12:40, the main entrance. Glass doors, enormous, facing the harbor, was locked. I tried 3 secondary entrances. Locked. I circled to the loading dock on the south side, a massive bay designed for 18-wheelers. The roll-up door was closed but not locked. The latch mechanism had been forced once already, the metal bent and scraped. Someone had been here before me. I got the crowbar under the door's edge and lifted. The door rose with a groan that echoed through the empty loading area and out into the street behind me, and I ducked under and let it fall shut. Inside, the convention center was dark and vast and cold. My flashlight carved a narrow beam through a space designed for trade shows and expos, now filled with folding tables, stacked chairs, and there, against the far wall, pallets. Pallets wrapped in plastic, stacked 4 high, marked with FEMA labels and Maryland State Emergency Management insignia. Cases of MRS, cases of water, medical supply kits in red bags, portable fuel canisters, 5-gallon military surplus still sealed. Not all of it was intact. Someone had torn into 3 of the pallets. Cases were ripped open, MREs scattered on the floor, water bottles crushed. But the damage was selective, hasty. The work of people grabbing what they could carry and leaving the rest. Easily 60% of the supplies were untouched. I stood there in the dark, my flashlight beam playing across pallets of food and fuel and medicine, and the feeling that went through me was not relief. It was something rawer. It was the feeling of a man who has been counting days and preparing to die, and suddenly, involuntarily, being forced to imagine a future. I couldn't carry it all. Not even close. A case of MREs weighs about 22 pounds and contains 12 meals. I could carry 2 cases, maybe 3 with the water and medical supplies. But I needed fuel more than anything. Those 5-gallon cans of diesel would buy us weeks of heat. One can weigh about 45 pounds. I could carry one, maybe. I loaded the canvas bag with 3 MRE cases, 36 meals, roughly 50,000 calories. Enough for 5 people for about 7 days at 1,400 calories each. I strapped a medical supply kit to the outside with zip ties I found in a maintenance closet near the loading dock. I picked up 1 5-gallon fuel can in my left hand and the crowbar in my right, and I walked out of the convention center carrying over 100 pounds of survival. The walk back took 40 minutes. My left arm went numb at the shoulder from the fuel can's weight. I switched hands every 2 blocks, the crowbar tucked under whichever arm wasn't carrying fuel, and my progress was slow and loud. The MREs shifted and clattered in the bag, the fuel can sloshed, my breathing was ragged and visible in the cold air. I was the noisiest thing in Baltimore. On Charles Street, 2 blocks from the Harmon Building, I saw another person. He was standing in the entrance of a parking garage, half in shadow. A man, maybe my age, wearing a heavy coat and holding a plastic grocery bag. He saw me. I saw him. We looked at each other across 30 feet of empty street, and neither of us moved. He raised one hand, not a wave, an acknowledgement. A gesture that said, I see you, you see me, we are both still here. I nodded. He nodded. I kept walking. He stayed where he was. I don't know his name. I don't know if he survived. I think about him more than seems rational. That brief, wordless exchange on a dead street. 2 men carrying what they could, choosing not to be threats to each other. The smallest unit of civilization. The decision not to take when taking was possible. I reached the loading dock at 1:20. I knocked. 3 hits, pause, 3 more. And heard Marcus's voice, thin and strained from inside. Hal? It's me. Open up. The gate rose. Marcus was standing there with his hands still on the chain, and when he saw what I was carrying, his face did something I'd never seen on him. It opened. Not a smile. Something before a smile, something more involuntary, the face of a person who had allowed themselves to stop believing and was now being asked to start again. I made 3 more trips over the next 2 days, each one easier in terms of route and harder in terms of my body. My knees swelled, my lower back seized on the 3rd trip so badly that I had to stop on Lombard Street and lean against a mailbox for 5 minutes, breathing through it, my eyes watering from the pain. But I brought back fuel. Enough diesel to add 30 days to our supply. Enough MREs for 6 weeks. Enough medical supplies to handle most emergencies short of surgery. On the 3rd trip, I also brought back something that wasn't on any inventory sheet. In the convention center, near the medical pallets, I found a box of FEMA pamphlets. Useless, mostly. Instructions for sheltering in place, boiling water, recognizing symptoms. But folded inside one of the pamphlets was a hand-drawn map. Someone, a first responder, a FEMA worker, someone with knowledge, had sketched a map of Baltimore with locations marked in red ink. Federal Hill, marked Safe Zone. Active, Fort McHenry, marked Med Station, Canton, marked Water Distrib, and the convention center itself, marked Supply. Open access. The map was undated. I had no way of knowing if these zones were still active, still staffed, still safe. But it was information. It was a direction. I showed the map to the group that evening. We sat in our office on 12, all 5 of us eating MREs. Beef stew for me, chicken and rice for Marcus, vegetable crumbles for Joy, who turned out to be vegetarian even at the end of the world, which struck me as an admirable commitment to principle. Mrs. Okafor had the chili mac and declared it with diplomatic precision, edible. Micah ate his entire MRE plus the cracker and the peanut butter packet, and then fell asleep in Joy's lap with the empty wrapper still in his fist. Federal Hill, Joy said, studying the map. That's a mile. If there's a safe zone there. If, Marcus said. If, Joy agreed. But if, Mrs. Okafor looked at me. You are thinking about whether to take us there. I was. I was thinking about whether to leave the building, this building that I'd kept alive for 40 days, that had kept us alive, that I knew from boiler to rooftop, every valve and riser and circuit breaker, and walk 5 people through streets I couldn't guarantee were safe to a location I couldn't confirm existed, based on a hand-drawn map from an unknown source. The building is running, I said. We have fuel, we have food. We could stay another month, maybe 6 weeks. And then, Mrs. Okafor asked. She'd asked this question before, on day 37. She asked it the same way now. Not challenging, just persistent. A nurse who knows that avoiding the prognosis doesn't change it. We left on day 43. I won't describe the walk in tactical detail because the tactical detail isn't the point. The point is this. I carried Micah on my back for the last quarter mile because his legs gave out, and the weight of him, 40-some pounds of 6-year-old boy, his arms around my neck, his breath against my ear, was the heaviest and lightest thing I have ever carried. Joy walked point because her EMT training included triage of environments, not just people. Marcus walked beside Mrs. Okafor, matching her pace, which was slow but unrelenting, and he did not once look back at the building we were leaving. I looked back once. The Harmon building stood against the gray sky, 42 floors of concrete and glass, its dark windows reflecting nothing. Federal Hill was real, the safe zone was real, a chain-link perimeter, military vehicles, tents, and people, actual living people in uniform. Some of them and many more not in uniform, just alive, just there, gathered around barrel fires and folding tables, wearing mismatched clothes and expressions I recognized because they were mine. Exhaustion, relief, and the strange grief that comes with surviving something you're not yet sure is over. A guardsman at the gate checked us in. He wrote our names in a logbook. A paper logbook because the computers were down. And I spelled HAROLDBOSCH and watched him write it and thought about Mrs. Okafor's notebook, about the records we keep because someone should know we were here. They had heat, they had food, they had a medical tent where a tired doctor listened to Micah's chest and said he was dehydrated but fine, and listened to my chest and said I had bronchitis and needed rest. And I almost laughed because rest was such a foreign concept that it sounded like a word from another language. That first night in a canvas tent, on a cot, under a wool blanket, I lay still and listened to the sounds of a camp. Generators, distant conversation, a child crying somewhere, a radio playing, something I couldn't identify. Micah slept on Joy's cot next to mine. Mrs. Okafor was in the women's tent, where she'd immediately begun organizing the other residents with the efficiency of a woman who had run pediatric wards during Lagos power outages and found a tent city in Baltimore to be a manageable challenge. Marcus was somewhere. I'd lost track of him during intake, which worried me until I found him, an hour later, sitting outside the communications tent, talking to a woman about satellite uplinks. I lay on my cot and pulled from my jacket pocket a FEMA pamphlet I'd kept, not for the information, which was useless, but because folded inside it, tucked behind the hand-drawn map, was a small piece of notepaper I'd found and not shared with anyone. It was in the same handwriting as the map, and it said, "Still here, still working. Don't stop." I held the note and stared at the canvas ceiling and thought about the man on Charles Street who had raised his hand. I thought about Diane on the radio who had kept broadcasting until she couldn't. I thought about whoever had drawn the map and left it where someone would find it. I thought about Naomi, who I still did not know was alive, who I might not know was alive for weeks or months. And the not knowing was a wound I would carry the way you carry a burn. Always aware of it, always adjusting around it, never able to put it down. But I was here, outside a building, under a sky, breathing air that tasted like November, and diesel smoke and canvas, and other people's cooking. And the boy was asleep, and the nurse was organizing, and the programmer was talking about satellites, and the EMT was checking on a stranger in the next tent, and I was lying still for the first time in 43 days, in the absence of a system to maintain. No boiler to check, no pump to monitor, no diesel gauge to read. Felt like a phantom limb, like the ache of something removed that my body still expected to find. I folded the note and put it back in my pocket. I closed my eyes. I had kept the building alive, and the building had kept me alive, and now we had both let go. I wrote this story because I've been thinking about the people who stay. When disaster hits, real disaster, not the movie version. There's a moment where most people's instinct is to flee. Get out, get away, get somewhere else. That instinct makes sense, but there are always people who stay, and not because they're brave or reckless, but because they have a specific relationship to a place. Building engineers, hospital staff, water treatment operators, linemen, people who understand that infrastructure is not abstract. It's a living system that someone has to tend, or it dies, and when it dies, so does everything that depends on it. Hal isn't a hero, he's a man who knew one thing well: how buildings work, and when everything fell apart, he did what he knew. Sometimes that's all survival is. Not courage, not brilliance, just the stubborn application of whatever competence you actually have to whatever problem is actually in front of you. The emotional core of this story, for me, is about the difference between keeping something running and being willing to walk away from it. Hal's identity was so fused with the building that leaving felt like losing himself, but staying forever was dying slowly. The real survival was recognizing the moment when the thing you'd been protecting became the thing holding you in place. 3 questions I'd love to hear your thoughts on. First, Hal calculated that the pump swap was the right engineering call over evacuating everyone to lower floors. Given the risk of frozen pipes in the abandoned upper floors versus the certainty of losing residential shelter, would you have made the same choice? Second, when Joy and Micah arrived, Hal let them in knowing it cut his group's food supply nearly in half. If you were responsible for Mrs. Okafor and Marcus, and the numbers were that tight, would you have opened that gate? Third, Hal never reached Naomi. He spent 43 days not knowing whether his daughter was alive, and he chose not to try calling during the narrow window when cell towers might have worked. What would you have done with that window? And what does it say about us that sometimes we'd rather not know? Thank you for staying with this one. I'll see you in the next story.